Hello, Houston. We are finished with the first exam, roughly the first third of the course, actually slightly more than that. And today we're going to pick up on our discussion of one more aspect of memory, and that is essentially the strategies that we can use to meet people, recognize them, and also recall their name in a given situation. I want to start with some general facts about memory. And what that has to do with is essentially what's called the total time effect. It demonstrates that the total time that you take to master a given set of information will, within limits, essentially be a constant. Okay? It also is important, however, in how you spend that time. And that has to do with the fact that if you're studying with the radio on, with the TV on in the background, and with your cognitive psych book in your lap, that is not quality time. In essence, the idea of needing to study with radio is a myth widely perpetrated by resistant high school students. But it is not something you should carry into college with you, because except for very limited data suggesting under unique conditions of ADD and or too much experience with the radio having been on, I would challenge you to find any evidence supporting that learning is better when the radio or the television are on. Those are basically distractions, and they're designed to attract our attention. That's what the advertisers are paying for. So it actually works out to the benefit of the people who are in fact watching, paying for the program. But it's designed to attract our attention, and that's not what you want when you're trying to study something. There are, on the other hand, some declining effects related to overlearning. Okay, so the amount learned depends on the cumulative time that you devote to learning, but there's a point of diminishing returns. And that has to do with the fact that essentially when you're overlearning for any given level of mastery, the amount of time to achieve that level is a constant. But if you then start overlearning, you start practicing again, the first time you can recall a given percentage, the next time maybe you can do it a little more rapidly, and so forth. But there comes a point beyond which putting any additional time into trying to learn the material simply is not beneficial. It doesn't result in greater memory as reflected in more rapid recall. There is, however, another thing related to the total time effect, and that is what's called the distributed practice effect. We could call it in a couple of different ways. So we've got the declining effects of overlearning, but let's also talk about, well, my thing, it seems to be going in the opposite direction here. We'll get there eventually. And that has to do with essentially the distributed practice effect. All other things being equal, it is broadly true that distributed practice leads to better recall than massed practice. Much better. There is essentially research documenting that goes back as much as 50 years. In the 1950s, for instance, I can find for you 33 over 30 consecutively numbered Roman numeral studies conducted by Benton Underwood. And with one exception, under a unique set of circumstances, it was always and in all ways the case that distributed practice is better than massed practice in terms of the recall, the ease of learning, and also the ability to recall the information that you're trying to learn. You might ask why. Well, there's several reasons why that's true. One is the fact that you have time to think about more linkages. In terms of what you're trying to remember, you have a greater length of time to link this fact to that fact or what you've already accumulated and so forth. Secondly, what it does is to eliminate the tiredness that accumulates in all of us, or the boredness anytime we're studying for an extended period of time. It takes much more time to think. It gives you much more time to think about the material that you're trying to master. And essentially, studying material for shorter intervals means that you're fresh when you're ready to study it again. All of those work to the betterment, the betterment, or the benefit is the word I'm looking for, the benefit of distributed practice. Given a set amount of time, given what we were talking about, the total time hypothesis, it is better to divide an hour worth of time in cognitive psych into 4 sessions of 15 minutes each than 1 hour just prior to an exam. The net effect of carrying away the information will ultimately be better on you. There's another one we can look at, and that is what's called a testing effect. Okay? Let me just remind you again, the recall is better in distributed conditions than in massed practice. Which leads us to another effect in addition to distributed practice, and that is what's called the testing effect. And this one was kind of counterintuitive in terms of what it actually demonstrated. I would be hard-pressed, for instance, to demonstrate the difference between graduates, the top undergraduates at Cambridge or Oxford, in comparison with graduates at the major universities in this country, whether it be Rice or U of H or anywhere else. The only major difference in the way in which students in Europe are educated and those in the United States is that we tend in the US to spend a lot more time testing, teaching but then testing. A casual examination might suggest that studying is an aid to input and retention, whereas testing mainly seems to value retention and retrieval. Doesn't turn out to be quite true. A more careful examination by Roddy Roediger, who, as I said, was formerly at Rice, and Karpik in 2006 shows that testing previously learned material improves long-term retention. What he did in this study was to use basically two groups under two conditions. One of the two conditions studied a set of scientific essays and then had the opportunity to study it again. The second group studied the essays one time and then were put into a testing condition where they spent about the same amount of time with the testing material, but the studied material. But in this case, they were being tested about it instead of studying it additionally, and the effect was rather interesting, and that is, in this case, when they were tested about 5 minutes after the initial material that they were read and were to recall, the recall favored, in fact, the situation that is where they'd studied it rather than studied it and then studied it and then being tested, the red bar in that case. But look at what happens if we test it 2 days later. Now, in fact, the recall of those who studied it and then studied it again is less than those who studied it and then were tested on it. And in fact, a week later, that difference is essentially the same. The effect there is that basically, well, it's pretty obvious there, and that is that if you're tested on it and then have to retain it at some later time, your recall is ultimately better in that way. If you think back to the SQ3R technique that we talked about on day one, we talked about surveying, questioning, and then read, recite, and review. And it's that recitation that really seems to be particularly helpful. That is that as we pointed out at the time, any exam you take here at the university is an exercise in output, not input. And so spending additional study time is, for most people, simply reading or input situation, not output in a given learning effort. And basically what Roediger and colleagues were able to demonstrate is that the act of testing can, in fact, be a very beneficial way to kind of draw the line in the sand for you in terms of where it's beneficial to whether you may need to spend a little more time with the material. So the SQ3R technique really mentions that or demonstrates that, as does this study by Roediger and colleagues in 2006. Okay, so now let's look at another vital vehicle regarding recall, and that has to do with the impact of imagery on our ability to actually recall information. An obvious question here that you've probably been asked before: is a picture worth 1,000 words or 10,000? Pick a number. But the answer is, if you had to actually in detail recall that picture, the answer is overwhelmingly yes, that if you can remember the picture itself, you'll be a lot better off. Suppose for some bizarre reason you were actually required to recall where the drops of water are in the background. That's, we can remember the image, but without studying that in detail, that's not something you're going to store in verbal memory under any condition. So actually a picture itself can be worth a great deal of money. There was a study done by Canizio and Haber in which they showed subjects, this is unbelievable, they showed subjects 2,560 pictures, 10 seconds apiece. See a picture for 10 seconds and then go to the next one. So it was a significant amount of time spent displaying 2,560 pictures, 10 seconds each. What they found in the recall period was that essentially subjects could recall 93% of those pictures. That's 2,380 pictures recalled. And I would remind you of the similarity here to the accuracy of recall that was demonstrated by the study we reviewed in the last lecture by Harry Barrick regarding retention of the images of people whom you'd gone to high school with, in some cases years and years before. In this study, the one by Canizio and Haber, the rapid rate of presentation makes it highly unlikely that it was stored verbally. It's much more likely that the image was stored qua image, that is, as an image. There is something about visual images that in fact does seem to aid recall. Coslin, Ball, and Reiser, I should say, in 1978, actually created a map with various locations and varying labeled distances, and the map looked essentially like this. What they did essentially was to take the schedule for the trains leaving San Francisco headed up over the mountains toward Reno, and what they found was that people's recall was better in a situation where the map was proportional than in one where it was unproportional. That is, the distances are but one of the things that we learn, and in fact the idea that it takes X amount of time to go 32 miles to Livermore, if that's where you're going, versus the length of time it takes to go 179 miles is roughly proportional to the distances on that particular map. And what he found then was that imagery is, in fact, important in this as an aid to actual recall. And there is a traditional study that really makes that more powerfully than I have seen it made any other place. We keep going backwards here today on the map. I'll get you to the train stop eventually here. But let me show you one other study, and that was one that involved, essentially, let me just show you the results curve first, and I'll describe it for you. In this case, it was a paired associate learning task that had either high imagery words or low imagery words, and they were either in the stimulus or the response position. And the results were quite clear-cut when this was done. And that is that in terms of ability to retain a 12-item list, it is essentially perfect if the stimulus term is high imagery in the same way that the response term is high imagery. They were essentially 12 out of 12 in their ability to recall that information. It does drop somewhat in the high imagery stimulus term, but low imagery response term, down to about 9, about 3/4 correct. But look at the effect if the lead term is, whoops, I need to go back. We'll get there in a minute. There we go. And let me show, there you go. I was expecting another curve there, and I forgot that everything is here. If you'll notice, look at the disastrous effect of not having a high imagery value stimulus term in either of those latter two conditions. What makes that particularly powerful as a comment is to compare the middle two curves, because in that case, it is exactly the same information. In the left-hand situation, the high imagery portion of the list was in the stimulus condition. In the right hand of the two, in the third of the four positions across the graph, it was in the right hand, the recall position. And in essence, that made about from 9 down to about 6. It made about a 30% difference in recall in those two situations of lists that were essentially identical material. So in essence, what's being hinted at here is the relative value of having an imagery-rich substance or stimulus, I should say, to aid your recall. And we're going to see that play out even in things like mnemonics as we look at them a little bit later. Let me show you a particularly colorful thing that was done by a colleague of mine, Roy Lockman, here at the University of Houston, back near the beginning of the arrival of cognitive psychology as a study technique. What he did was to describe the following situation. He asked people to listen to or read a story and then try to recall it a little bit later. And so what I'll do is simply read the story to you first in the following condition, and I'm giving it to you in what is called high syntactic constraint. This particular list of 74, 75 words, in one case was simply scrambled in word pairs of 1 or 2 or 3, well, pairs would make it 2, but in clusters of 1 or 2 or 3 words, and they were simply randomized through the essay. In the medium constraint, it was more closely approximating true English, and in the case I'm going to read it to you in high syntactic constraint, you're seeing it in the actual order in which the essay was written. Think about the following as a memory technique. How many of the following words can you remember? With hocked gems financing him, our hero bravely defied all scornful laughter which tried to prevent his scheme. Your eyes deceive, he had said. An egg, not a table, correctly typifies our unexplored planet. Now 3 sturdy sisters sought proof, forging along sometimes through calm vastness, yet more often over turbulent peaks and valleys. Days became weeks, as many doubters spread fearful rumors about the edge. At last, from nowhere, welcome winged creatures appeared, signifying momentous success. In that case, if you'll go back to the graph, I will show you what the results were. In that case, I've given you no title. I've simply given you the essay of 75 words. Now let me give you one additional verbal hint, and that looks like this. And listen to the essay again. With hoc to gems financing him, our hero bravely defied all scornful laughter which tried to prevent his scheme. Your eyes deceive, he had said, an egg, not a table, correctly typifies our unexplored planet. Now 3 sturdy sisters sought proof, forging along sometimes through calm vastness, yet more often over turbulent peaks and valleys. Days became weeks, as many doubters spread fearful rumors about the edge. At last, from nowhere, welcome winged creatures appeared, signifying momentous success. Do you see any difference? Is it any easier to recall? Well, it turns out in that condition, it is easier to recall. It is substantially easier to recall. In fact, simply adding that one word, Columbus, puts the whole thing in structure, in a sequence for you, because in essence what's happened in that situation is that the story is specifically about Christopher Columbus's departure from Europe and trip to discover America. But it's written in kind of indirect ways. So in your case, 3 sturdy sisters become what? Yeah, the ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Turbulent peaks and valleys become the surging ocean waves, and so forth. And so once you have that, what's called an advance organizer, Columbus, in the case of interpreting this, is an advance organizer. Once you have that, the recall of the information is markedly easier. We've gone from 12, where it was simply the words, essentially, to 20 as a recall. We've added about 60 to 70% to our recall, giving you nothing more than the hint Columbus as a way, a theme around which to organize the words of the material. But it does make a significant difference. The advance organizer clearly facilitates recall in this situation. So the question then is the following, and that is, oops, I went one too far again. Boy, I've just got itchy fingers today. The idea is that a photo is essentially an analog. That is, for every aspect of the image there is a parallel portion in the stored image, that is, in the image that is stored within your brain, and that is what's called an analog storage. The question is, and it's a hotly debated issue in cognitive psychology, is that is there something in long-term memory that is essentially an equivalent to a visual perception with all of the details that are involved? That's a question that we're going to be wrestling with here a bit today. There are 2 cautions related to that particular question and this image. The question is not about anything involving imagination. That is, no one doubts that in fact you and I can imagine things. We can think about things in our own head and do so quite freely. But for example, if you look at the thing that I tried to get in your head here a minute ago, too early, look at this as an abstract map of Houston, and recognize, in fact, that you live in Meyerland, down in the lower left corner of the square there, and you've got to see your dentist in Northwest Houston. You've got to get your car serviced. You've got to pick up your laundry. You've got to get milk at the grocery store, and you've got to reach U of H in time for a 7 p.m. exam. Certainly, that could involve some active imagining on your part. There are various orders in which you could accomplish that, and one might, for instance, labeling the routes, go about it this way. Those are the things we cited, so you're just going to drive to your dentist, pick up the garage, and eventually get to U of H. That does not, however, turn out to be absolutely the most efficient way in which to do that. Instead, pretty obviously, what you should do as you're leaving your house in Meyerland is go to Galleria and pick up each of the things in what is basically the shortest possible distance. Okay? And that's one case where we're having a map, and it's that which reflects the actual spatial relations is very helpful in terms of saving your time and the amount of time we can spend stuck in traffic in this particular situation. Pavio has tied that into, well, wait a minute, there is one other thing that I wanted to talk about, and that is, what is the functional equivalent of the images that you and I look at and the visual perception in which we engage? That is, if we can't establish the identity of memory representation, that it's identical to visual perception, then we're going to have to argue that if we can set up experimental situations in which imagery should most likely be used, we would expect then that performance in that would bear some degree of relationship to moving around the actual world. That is, if you're moving around in a visual image in your head, theoretically the distance, the time to do so, should take a certain amount of correlated time to the length of time that you would spend moving from point A to point B here in Houston. Pavio has tied this back to the real world with some work related to the recall of concrete and abstract words. And he basically raises the issue regarding the recall of concrete words, I should say, actually being better than that for abstract words. So concrete words refer essentially to touchable real-world events or concepts or objects particularly, and they're easily imaginable. Imaginable, it's the word I was after there. Well, they're manageable too, but in essence they're imaginable. A word like cat, for instance, can very easily be converted into a tiger if you've been to the zoo, your own cat, whatever. But it's easy to create an image related to a word like cat. You take a word like cigarette. Again, it's no great shock to develop an image for a cigarette. And automobile is where you can really begin to have fun. It would be an interesting projective test, I suspect, if we figured out what kind of a car you would image. This is my own commute car. But in essence, it's very easy for you and I to take those concrete words and draw up images that are related to it. But let's look at abstract words. They have much less obvious real-world anchors and points and representations of them in a concrete manner. So if you take a very important word in our society like truth, the net result is there's no image that immediately pops to mind, and for every person in the room, we've probably got a different image in the head. Secondly, we take another abstract word like justice, same problem. Yeah, we know how to use it. We can use it quite accurately in a sentence. But the image that it draws is as different as each of us in terms of our past experience with the word, with the use of it, and so forth. Even Truth, Justice, and the American Way. The one thing I couldn't find was an uncopyrighted version of Superman. So I'm just going to have to rely on your imagination to do that one for me. But in essence, the American Way is an abstract concept. It's tied specifically to Superman, which is a concrete image, but it is itself an abstract word is the phrase that I'm looking for there. Now let's play with those abstractions for just a minute, and let's try the following. What I want you to do is to imagine a cigarette, which is unlit initially. And what we're going to do actually is to light it, okay? Took a minute. It's a breathing emphysema problem. But we've got it lit. Now what I'm going to ask you to do is to imagine that it's been partway smoked. You've partly enjoyed it, killing yourself with it, but you've partly smoked it. And in essence, this is the kind of image that you end up with in this situation. Concrete objects are very easy to work with. And in fact, we spend a lot of time in our head doing exactly that, particularly when we're in a boring class. One of the worst signs of distraction for an instructor is a set of bobbing feet, somebody who's got their leg crossed with one of them bobbing. That is a sure sign that nothing important is going on in the head of that person, let alone any course-related material. But what that leads to, theoretically, is a very interesting problem, and that is what is sometimes referred to as the dual code hypothesis, or theory, that was developed by Alan Pavio. It's P-A-I-V-I-O is his name, if you want to look it up. And he essentially asserts that a picture memory may be stored and remembered in either of two ways. It can be stored either in terms of verbal code, or it can be stored in terms of what he calls imaginal code, or imagery, which really facilitates better recall because it retains so many more details of an image than simply a verbal encoding could or does. That is, recalling an image rather than the word is ultimately inherently richer in the situation. And so better recall of images is attributed to the richer array of information that is stored in the imaginal code. That's basically what's being argued here. Words can be stored in a verbal code, but can be converted into an imaginal code. Apple versus the image of apple suggests one important parallel there, and that is that the concrete word can be stored either way. So there are more available cues. Abstract words, on the other hand, can only be stored abstractly. I'll get it eventually. For some reason, I seem to be going backwards today. But that image is a lot easier to store and more rewarding to recall, easier to recall when you need it. And so in essence, what we're arguing essentially is that two codes are better than one. So yes, you can store an abstract word, but it's pretty clear that when you look at concrete words, they can be stored either as the word itself or as the image to which it refers. And in that case, probably the recall of the word is considerably easier to achieve from the concrete operations that have been involved in initially storing it. So then the question then becomes, can memory in fact actually be based on visual images? Richmond and researchers, colleagues working with him, demonstrated some rather interesting correlations between mental distances and reaction times. And they used the most simple of imagery to do this. What they did was to show subjects an image of a clock, for instance, say set to 3:20. And they asked them essentially reaction time questions related to how long is it from 3:20 to 7:30. And of course, you can easily convert that to a subtraction task, but we can even make that a little more difficult for you if, in fact, we convert the comparison time to 6 o'clock. And it turns out the longer distance you had to travel between any given time, the longer it took to get the correct answer. Okay? That is, it was easier to talk about 2 hours and 40 minutes here than it was whatever it was, 3 or 4 hours and something in the other example that I gave you. It's been looked at in another way, and I'm kind of compiling a lot of traditional research together here for you. But this involved, essentially, I knew I was going to skip this, but this was the recall based on the imagery that subjects reported creating in the type of research that we've talked about before. And if you look at the reaction time, it is much easier, shorter, quicker reaction time when you're dealing with a high imagery object than it is when you're recalling a low imagery object. It can add as much as 50% to the recall time. The difference in imagery is that powerful. We look at it in another way. Neisser and colleagues looked at it in the following kind of way. I love this study. If you look at or think about an upright piano, you cannot see a bicycle that is parked behind the piano. Okay? There is one actually there. You may not see it, but you can actually recall it. And that's the question. If the image that you've stored, if your memory is based is like a visual perception, you ought not to be able to see or remember an image of a bicycle behind that piano, even if you watched a movie of the bike being parked there, if the memory is strictly visual. Okay? And so in essence what they did was to develop a series of images like this, where one object could be hidden by another one, and then they would give a sentence such as, a bicycle is parked behind an upright piano. And the subject was encouraged to visualize it. They didn't actually have an image in front of them in that case, but they were encouraged to visualize it in that situation. And the results were that in that situation, if they were later given a cue such as the hidden bicycle, they were asked to recall the entire sentences, and the result was essentially that they were equally able to recall bicycle or piano, and thus the entire sentence, even compared to the recall sentences when the initial sentence was one such as, a bicycle is parked on top of a stand-up piano, which is essentially the same description, but the bike is in a different position. And it turns out in the image that you and I have, it doesn't matter whether both images that you're storing are visible, or in fact one of them is behind the other one. It makes no difference in the recall which is facilitated by that image. Hopefully you see a couple of problems here, because I've been bellowing out like this is the final word on it, and in fact it really isn't. What guarantees do we have in these last two described experiments, for instance, that the subject has actually used only visual imagery? Or for that matter, what guarantees do we have that they've used only one view of the scene? It might be interesting to try this with lower levels of Piagetian sophistication. I'm not aware that this experiment has been done, but essentially where there's less object permanence on a comparable task, it might be interesting to see what the effects would be on reaction time and recall of images where in one case the bike is behind a piano that hides the view, and in the other case is on top of the piano that hides the view. So in essence, the research that's been done so far doesn't really seem to offer an irrefutable test of what's being challenged here. Essentially, Keenan and Moore offered a much more powerful kind of test. They used stronger instructions in this particular situation, indicating the lack of visibility of the hidden objects. And they found differential recall favoring now the visual object in this case, suggesting that memory is like a visual object. And we're going to see that that shows up in some of the other research. Kerr, in 1983, utilized congenitally blind subjects. I'll get there eventually. I know it's there. There we are. Okay. And he said that what he was able to demonstrate in this study was that those with no vision should not benefit from visual imagery. Imagining objects who are spatially close actually did result in that situation in better recall. And imagining objects that were spatially separated by some distance, in fact, led to worse recall of the information that was involved. And sighted and blind subjects performed equally, which really argues instead that there's a separate visual perception like memory. But verbal memory is in fact possible in that situation. So the evidence has been quite conflicted down through the years. The problem that we've got is essentially how do we account for the better effects of recalling concrete words? Because that is a clearly demonstrated effect. And what has been proposed by those who are campaigning for the visual image-based memory is essentially the idea that we create what is called a propositional code. Okay? And that code is defined simply as an abstract representation of both verbal and pictorial materials. Okay, well, I'll get it there eventually. I'm not pushing the button often enough here for you. But a propositional code is essentially an abstract representation of both verbal and pictorial membrane. We're arguing essentially that all incoming information is encoded in propositional code, regardless of the form that it comes in. To experience an image, the underlying propositional code is the source from which to generate the experience. The question then is, of course, can this account for different recall rates for concrete and for abstract words? It's asserted that the reason for the difference in reaction time is because abstract sentences in general are more complex. Differential recall is attributed to the greater difficulty of encoding the more complex abstract sentence in the proposition that's being proposed there. But the argument really remains, how do we theoretically explain the difference in the speed of recall of a concrete word versus an abstract word? And that in turn leads us into a rather interesting array of now visually based recall information or recall challenges. I want to go back over one just quickly here that we've already talked about, and that is the keyword recall the keyword method for recalling information. And what I was suggesting here is that you remember the rhyme, and it is rhyme based. 1 is bun, 2 is shoe, 3 is tree, door, hive, sticks, heaven, gate, line, pen, and I can do that list from memory because each of those words rhymes with the word that it is paired with. So the idea is, the challenge for you is essentially that you can remember the numbers 1 to 10. And what's offered here is essentially an imagery-rich version of those words. And the link then is, the task is that what you've essentially set up for yourself in developing this kind of a mnemonic was graphed earlier in the graph that I showed you, where we looked at recall of paired associates, where we pair high imagery versus low imagery words. And even if they are low imagery words, the recall, given that you've pre-memorized this list of words which rhymes with the numerical position, Essentially, the recall is greater simply because you're learning either a high imagery list. If you're trying to link to these, suppose your mom calls you in the car on the way to on the way you're driving home. She wants you to stop at the grocery store, and she reads off while you're in the middle of traffic on 59, 9 items that you're supposed to pick up. Well, what this list is suggesting is that you form a link between bun and shoe and tree, each of those individual images, and the specific image that you're being asked to recall. Bun is easy if she asks you to do hot dogs and various things like that. But in essence, that's the key word method, but you'll see that it's actually based on imagery-rich stimulus terms. That's the whole idea behind what makes that method work, and it does. The second one is a little more complex, and that involves basically what is called the method of loci, or location. In essence, in this particular situation, what you're asked to do is, and I've described this briefly in a previous tape, but I want to spend a couple of minutes on it because it is so imagery rich, and point that out, that in essence, what you're asked to do in this situation is to create in your own head a mental journey from anywhere to anywhere else in your life that you normally do. In my case, it was quite easy. I simply imagined myself sitting at the monitor where I write the lectures and gather the material that I'm interested in. And so the monitor itself, I could picture anything on the monitor. Just to its right is a printer, which then becomes image number 2. You can see several different places there where you might store images or imagine putting it into the paper tray or something like that. Next to that is the wastebasket. This is not the printer. It's actually another thing I'm going to talk about in a minute. The printer's over here. So if I've turned to the right in my chair, it goes from screen to printer to wastebasket. Then as we're coming around the end of the desk to the right, there is the shelf, which is normally in that position, which in turn gets me to the desk that my assistant, oh, I'm sorry, that's my desk. I was going to blame that mess on somebody else for a change. But it's my desk, and there is a leather chair there where you can easily remember you create an image of that. And in turn, as you're going out of my office, there is a round table to the right. The roundness invites some kind of imagery. As you're going out through the outer office, there are either the journals and bookshelf that offers or the file cabinet, either one of which might be an effective retrieval cue. So if you go out the door and hang a left toward the easiest exit, there's a drinking fountain, isolated right there as another one that you could essentially imagine an object hung up in or attached to in some way. If you look down the hallway there's a pseudo Xerox machine. It's not Xerox, so it's pseudo, but it is in fact a copy machine. And in fact, when you get down to where that machine is and take a left here, what you're going to see is the elevator at this side of the columns, and then just beyond it are the recycling bins, which are still in position. In turn, as you go out the door, the lobby itself might offer some kind of an invite to you, or the railing, or the bench that's next to it. And in fact, the last target in my journey is the wastebasket. I can do that from memory without any problem at all. I have a specific image that I can call to mind with respect to each of those. And it makes essentially for a very, again, same idea. It's imagery rich. And in your case, I can't remember your list. You won't be able to remember mine because you don't make that journey. But for each of us, it offers an imagery-rich set of pre-organized, pre-ordered stimuli. So if for some bizarre reason you have to remember item number 5, you can drop down on the list to the 5th item. It was the monitor. Let me see if I can do it. The monitor, the printer, the wastebasket, the bookshelves, the chair at my desk. So I would have to look at whatever image I had stored with the chair on my desk as the last image in that case. I'll bet it's been a while since you spent a long time on television looking at a wastebasket, but that's essentially what we're doing there. So we're measuring essentially the method of loci in that, illustrating in that case the method of loci. And again, as I said, you can preserve ordinal position if for some reason that happens to be particularly important. I can think of a situation where your mother might ask you to get something at one store and something else at another store, the size of which determines what you're going to get at the second store. And so in that case, you might need to remember the particular order that was involved as you're buying the information. This in turn leads to some other topics that relate to our use of memory, and that has to do with recovered and false memory. This is going to tie back to the work that Beth Loftus has done, and it has led to some extraordinarily convoluted, that's the wrong word to use, complex and controversial sets of results. It has to do, first of all, with the recovered information that is involved. A question there, if you can get on the mic.
On the method of loci, are you just trying to say that you can remember different destinations, or I didn't really get what you were trying to incorporate with the memory?
In both of those cases, in the keyword method and also in the method of loci, the idea is that you have an ordered set of stimuli which themselves are imagery rich. And the theory is that if you need to retain a list of groceries of anything, where the substance of the list is important and you're not able to write it down, what both of these methods suggest is that you've set up for yourself what is at least a reasonably easy learning task, and that is you've got imagery-rich stimuli to which you're going to hang on or attach, form a linkage between each individual stimulus and the resulting response, where it's the response that you actually need to remember. So if you've overlearned that list, the recall is quite easy, essentially automatic, as it is for me with bun sticks. Well, I won't go through all the whole thing and embarrass myself, but essentially if I sit for a minute and think I can recall the rhyming words, I can also record the order of material in my office. And the idea is you've got an imagery-rich list, and if you think back or refer back in your notes to that curve that shows the impact of paired associate high and low meaning, imagery-rich, I should say. The two recall conditions that are easiest are those where the stimulus condition is imagery-rich. And both of the mnemonics that I've cited for you, and many others that exist also that you could take the time to refer to, all of them involve imagery-rich stimuli. So it's really intended to, not the list itself, but it's intended to aid your recall of whatever set of materials that you need to in a situation where you simply can't write them down for whatever reason. As, for example, in getting ready for a test. Theoretically, you're not supposed to write it all down and take it into test with you. So the mnemonic technique would be one of the various possibilities. So, in any case, let's go back and look at where we're headed here now, and that has to do with recovery or false memories. The original basis here, as you may know, actually comes from Freud's work on the concept of repression. It has a long history in psychology, where Freud has gradually kind of slipped from active consciousness for many psychologists these days. Certainly much of the discipline is based on his work, but we've moved well beyond his original ideas. He was basically arguing that events in the life of all of us as children, which are either sexually or aggressively threatening or pleasurable in some cases, are simply suppressed from active recall, whether we're ashamed of them or whatever. But it was that idea, the idea of repression, of an inability to recall, that really became the founding point for a significant amount of research related to cognitive psychology that involves specifically the activity of trying to recall that kind of information. Specifically where Beth Loftus got into this, and this work has been going on over the last 30 years or so, basically has to do with a technique that involves what is called therapist-assisted or encouraged recall. That is, one of the elements of therapy that may in some cases be involved is the therapist working with you to actually retrieve long thought to be repressed memories. The usual cases involve cases of recall of childhood sexual abuse. And many times the memory itself has been inaccessible literally for years. But there's an important sub-issue here that has to do with specifically, is memory permanent? What Beth Loftus did as a direct assessment of this was a study in which she showed subjects very complex pictures with myriad details. My desk that you saw a little earlier would have been a classic example of a picture, an image with myriad details in there. And what she had done in one of the pictures, just as a sample of what she was working with, was to show a man holding a book which was plainly colored red. It had a cover on it that made the book red in the course of the image. And then between the initial viewing and the subsequent test of the subject's ability to recall the image that he or she had been looking at, they were shown various kinds of information which essentially suggested that the book cover was actually green. In a variety of ways, it was implied that in fact the book cover was green. The subject was given false information in that particular instance. And the time of recall, the subject in this study was allowed to make two guesses about the color of the book. If the subjects were wrong on their first guess, their second guess was no more than chance. Okay, if they were wrong in the color on the first guess, their second guess was simply no more than chance level of accuracy, which squares off with an observation that I have also made in the tests that I do, particularly in intro. I haven't done this in cognitive or the other courses that I teach. But it was interesting to me that at one point we used to have the test scoring machine in the classroom. It was a small automated machine where you could just feed the sheet through. And it was kind of funny when you did it because it was a quite noisy machine. It went through a strip of paper and you fed it through linear on long edge. And what it did was to mark a minus sign by any sign any test item that was wrong. And the effect that you got was brrr, as it went through. If anybody missed a lot of answers, then you had a lot of brrring, and if they missed very little, there'd just be 3 or 4 clunks as it went through. But it was guaranteed the first time that happened, every head in the room went this way. You went from looking at top of heads to noses on every single person as an attention-getting device. But in that case, essentially, what I used to do in that, where you were able to test and score the test initially, I would give the test paper back to the students and let them go back and get a second shot at any of the items they had missed, thinking this was very generous, that we would demonstrate greater recall and so forth and so on. And I was very enamored of that idea, loved it, thought it was generous, the students liked it, and so forth and so on. And then I went back one year and I got curious about, am I actually benefiting in any way from the time that I spend doing that and benefiting the students? Well, it turns out that if you look at, let me just take an arbitrary number. Let us suppose out of a 50-item exam, a typical student gets 30 right first time. That means there are 20 remaining to be answered the second time. And it turned out that what they got right on the second one was 60%. That is, if they'd gotten 30 out of 50 right the first time, they got 30% of the remaining 20, or about 12 or 13 correct the second time, which meant that strictly in terms of measurement, I was not gaining anything by the second task. And that squares exactly with the results that were obtained here by Loftus in her ability to recall detail. Once lost, it's lost, basically, which is also suggesting that your first shot is, if you're smart, it may be smart to guess on the test again, because if you get a lot of them right and you're kind of vague about one of them, it's probably beneficial to go ahead and guess in that situation. But the giving it back for a second attempt on the missed items was a waste of everyone's time, as it turns out. It didn't improve the measurement. I mean, it may have made the students feel better. That's to be sure. But there was no significant gain in accuracy of measurement technique when we did it that way. So basically, the controversy overall here has to do with 2 very important questions related to the therapist, and that is, do therapists actually aid memory? That is, are they really facilitating recovery of missing information, or are they in fact implanting false memories? The one problem is that we cannot know that the correct answer is in any specific case. We cannot know a specific recall is a false memory or a recovered memory. We know that we can recover things that we've not thought about in years. I would reference, for instance, the Barrick study that we looked at in the previous lecture as the best single example of that. We sometimes recall false memories with high confidence that they're accurate. That doesn't turn out to be true. But that is the circumstances that often tend to produce false memories. That is, memories where in fact your recall was not as accurate as you thought it was. And I'm going to look at here in a minute some of the reasons why that kind of recall might actually happen in a given situation. But I've gone over a couple of different things here, and I just wanted to review for you that, in fact, the main controversy related to the problem raised by Loftus was the fact that you may, in fact, be aiding recovery of a missing piece of information that you have, in fact, experienced. But the danger is, particularly in therapeutic situations regarding, for instance, sexual matters in family, whether they do or don't occur, is that you may, in fact, given an inappropriate questioning technique, implant memories that simply never actually occurred. And I've got some studies that look at some of the ability to do that. Excuse me. At one time, at the time an event occurs, the subject has a thought in one situation I'm going to suggest here. The subject has a thought, and later they recall that thought, and they tend to recall it as if it occurred at the time of the event itself. For instance, Roediger and McDonald in 1995 did a study in which, I'm going to have to read this to you. I didn't realize I didn't have it on the thing here. I thought it did. Sorry about that. Listen up for a minute. I'm going to read some words to you. And I want you to remember them. I want you to learn them. I'm going to give you about, let's see, 3, 8, yeah. Okay, it's within the feasible limit of long-term memory, short-term memory. So let's give it a try. I'm going to read 8 words to you, as undiplomatically or flat-toned as I can. Thread, pin, eye, sewing, sharp, point, prick, thimble. Now, I'll ask it to you as a yes or no question, having now inserted about 10 seconds of absolutely time-wasted drivel so that you can't just sit there and rehearse all those words. Was the word needle included in the list of words I read to you? Was the word needle included in the list that I read to you? And in essence, that leads to some mumbling around the room. But in fact, what happened was that in that particular experiment done by Roediger and McDermott, needle was not included in the list. Much of what was involved there, from pricking your finger to the sewing that a needle allows, involves needles. But in fact, the needle was not mentioned itself in those words, all of which related to the act of sewing in one way or another. What happened was that needle was actually false positively recorded or recalled by over 50% of the subject in that experiment. It was a false positive. It was a mediator that tied everything else together, but it was not actually included in the words that were given in that situation. And the example I gave you before, I wanted to come back and give you some data on it because I forgot to include it last time. But you remember I talked about the idea of making a cup of tea. James Jenkins years ago did a very famous, what became a very interesting / famous study on making a cup of tea, and he indicated there were about 36 individual steps that you could do. Question, sorry.
What do you mean by actual memory?
If I'm using words loosely here, I apologize for that, but if I were going to anchor that, what I would do is put it in active memory in recall that you are able to actually generate. If you're asking in the broader context of what I'm in general discussing here, and that is Loftus's study versus facilitating recall of actual memory versus, if that's the way in which you're using it, I'm talking about events which did in fact happen, where you experienced them. I'm not referring to artificially made up memories. In that case, the actuality is anchored in fact. An actual memory would be a factual event. Maybe that's the word I should be using, factual memories, as opposed to fictional or generated memories of one sort or another. So in any case, he went through and took a picture, a sequence of 36 photos of the act of somebody standing in a standard kitchen, assembling what was necessary and making a cup of tea. When he went back, he asked people, showed people pictures of. He showed them 18. That was what they were shown as they spun the story of making a cup of tea and described it for them in graphic detail, illustrated with pictures. What they did then was to go back and show them all 36 pictures after a delay period, after a memory period. They showed them all 36 pictures, and they asked them in each case, true, false, did you in fact see, was this picture among those that you've already seen? And it turned out, among the 18 pictures that were not represented to the subjects, 80% of them generated false positives. 80% generated false positives. Now that's essentially consistent with essentially making up evidence. That would be an example of a fictional memory, where they had not seen the memory itself. What's happening here, and what we're building toward, I will suggest to you, and that is that what we're really building when we look at a picture of 18 slides of making a cup of tea, all of us know how to walk into the kitchen and assemble what's necessary to do a cup of tea. But if we simply are given 18 pictures of what that involves, the ability to separate those, I saw that, I didn't see that, is not quite so good, because really what's activated in you and I is the script that's involved in making a cup of tea. And if we didn't see the sugar bowl, we nonetheless know when we see it later that sugar bowl is very often involved in making a cup of tea, whether it's sugar bowl or saccharin or sucril or something else, some other artificial sweetener. But in any case, it's the entire image. I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong act here. It's the entire concept of making a cup of tea that is being activated, and the fact that an individual picture ties into that script exactly very much increases the likelihood that you'll do false positive. Put that in the context of something we're going to look at a little bit later, and that is what happens if you show somebody a Facebook beforehand And then one of the people in that Facebook happens to be in the lineup that you're later asked to judge. The work of Jenkins that I just described strongly argues in favor of the fact that you significantly increase the likelihood of a false positive identification of somebody whose picture happened to be looked at earlier, even though they weren't even involved in the mayhem that caused you to have to go into the police station. So it is a case that psychologists and this work on memory is important. It has some significant contributions to make to our understanding and trusting of eyewitness testimony. Another study done by Zaragoza and Mitchell in 1996 involved implanting memories after the event which was to be recalled. And in this case, what they did was to show a police film of a burglary, a fairly graphic film of a burglary actually taking place. This was followed later by a questionnaire about the event. People were asked a series of very specific questions to recall the details of the robbery that they had actually witnessed in that case. The questions in some of these questionnaires presupposed the existence of some of the details that might have been related to that event, which in fact weren't. They were not part of the film that was actually shown. For instance, did the young lady wearing jeans enter through the front or side door of the store? And in fact, the young lady who was robbed in that film was not wearing jeans at all. I have seen Beth Loftus. She was a guest of my introductory class here a number of years ago, and she actually demonstrated in class something that the students weren't prepared for. I was hoping she'd do it. And in fact, what she did, and she has a film of it that actually has been on an ABC national program at one point, but in her own classroom when the news cameras were there, what she did was she just happened to notice that a particular student was sitting on the very front row of the room with a purse sitting up on the fold-up bench where you sit and take notes normally. Her purse was just sitting there. And there was an entrance door to the room over on the right side, just by the corner of the room, near where the aisle left with the person in the front row sitting with the purse on the desk. What this person did was to simply open the door, walk in with all casualness, but nonetheless a considerable speed to, deliberateness, but movement target to what he was doing. As he walked past, he simply put his arm down and picked up the woman's purse and kept walking out the aisle. And as soon as he'd picked it up and gotten past her, he then put it so that it was less conspicuous as he was walking up the aisle. And the woman, it took her, the man was about halfway out of the room already, and this was a room that would seat, I guess, 100 as I remember it. So it was not a small room. He had to walk 6 or 8, 10 rows minimum to get out of the room. And in fact, what Loftus did was to react to the woman's reaction to the, hey, that man took my purse. And that's about all she had time to say before he was out the back door and gone. She then stopped class and simply indicated, I saw the jeans, I saw the beard. Did anybody else see any other feature that we should remember? And with the class, she developed an entire description of what was involved in this man. And then lo and behold, they actually brought in 4 people. They had a lineup on the stage of that classroom auditorium. And the person who was described was identified. It just turned out that that was not the person who had stolen. The person who'd actually walked into the room, picked up the purse and left, was not in the lineup at all. It turned out the person the class identified, in fact, was wearing jeans and in fact had a really nice, classy, neatly trimmed beard. He was identified. But in essence, what was involved there is essentially falsely implanted evidence in that case. The fact that Beth Loftus might have actually falsely recalled that and said it in all innocence. In her case, it was quite deliberate that she was trying to implant false evidence in that case to demonstrate how easy it is actually to do it. But if you think about the traditional police interrogation technique, it tends to be the same question asked over and over and over again in a situation where the subject gradually gets tireder and tireder and tireder. And eventually, the earliest questions that may have been asked earlier kind of recede into the indistinguishable area of memory, where the subject legitimately no longer can recall. I don't remember whether that person was wearing a red jacket or a black jacket. I just do not remember. Was he wearing a red jacket? Was he wearing a blue jacket? Was he wearing a green? You're essentially flooding memory in that case. In essence, and this is a study that I mentioned a little bit earlier, Loftus in 1997 did another rather interesting study. What she did was to interview relatives of youngsters, actually it was adolescents that were used in this case. She interviewed their parents, about various childhood events, age 5 or so. as the time when this event might have occurred. And she collected a variety of information about the subjects that were going to be in the experiment. And then she actually wrote out paragraphs that described the three situations. And she got the parents to double check it to make sure that, in fact, the paragraph actually described an event which both of them were in reasonable agreement as to the events that had happened in a given situation. And a fourth paragraph was included among the three that were given to the subject, late adolescent college student, essentially, to recall. And in essence, they were asked when they read each essay, they were asked to simply write on it, "I don't remember," for anything they did not remember. And what she found was that in the four paragraphs, she got 25% false positives in that situation. It was such a gripping story, and it had so many elements of what all of us have done at one time or another. That in fact 25% of them wrote an entire story, about being lost. Let me back up a little bit. I jumbled one thing in describing that. For each of the paragraphs that they had written, they were asked to write an essay about a particular event. Let's say the family picnic that we went to in the lake when the thunderstorm hit. An identifier like that. An event was given that level of description, and the subjects were asked to write a story if they remembered it, and so they were told to write on the essay paper, "I don't remember it," if they didn't. And in fact, one of them was the time you got lost at whatever mall as a cue, and 25% of them wrote about it in that particular situation. So that they even included in that case details in the story that were not evident, were not in fact present either in the mall or in the various other stories that were used there. So the conclusion here is essentially, now I've got this is going to be a great waste of time. Just showing you the list. I didn't have it in the right place, unfortunately. And so then what I was going to do was to hit you with this. Okay, yes or no? I'll just skim through these pretty rapidly for you. How well do you think you'd do if you went down through that list, true, false, in each situation? Well, it turns out those were the ones where you would say yes, and any others that you said yes to are in fact a false positive, a recall where it should not have occurred in that situation. So in essence, we've already talked about the T, we're talking now about implanted memory. And in essence, the situation that's involved there has to do with the fact that memory is at least two different things. It is in certain situations reconstructive, as when you're recalling something where you did in fact actually participate in the event itself. But in turn, the worrisome thing is that to a certain extent, you could think of it as a constructive model. That in fact you take the tea being a good example of we all know how to make a cup of coffee or tea. But if you have to recall specific events relative to a particular cup of tea that was made, false positives may occur because of the constructive nature of memory itself, that you're pulling in events that simply did not appear. Remember the question that I asked you earlier about the doorknob on your house? And in fact, in that case, the question is, do you open it to the left, to the inside? Do you open it to the right, to the inside? Do you open it to the left, to the outside? Or do you open it to the right, to the outside, going in? And in that case, what you really do in that case is reconstruct the image itself and then pull from it the detail that you need. There's a shelf located in this place, or there's a table here, or the stairs come up from this side or the other. And you have, as I said, except for the previous time when I mentioned it, you've never mentioned that. That's not something you've ever had to think about earlier. And that's classic illustration of the constructive nature of memory, that in some cases we add details that simply are not there. A good storyteller does that, essentially takes the element of an idea and adds the details to it. It's instructive to listen, for instance, to Garrison Keillor, who does a story from Lake Wobegon, which is the mythical lake up northwest of St. Paul, Minnesota. And it's interesting that if you listen to the tale that he's actually spinning, there is usually a theme part of the story itself. But in occasional instances, if you look, kind of reconstruct the entire story he told, he's ended up somewhere out in left field relative to whatever he started talking about. And that probably has to do with the embellishments that he adds, because my understanding is that he simply goes in with a story idea and then spins it for us live when he's telling that story, which has the advantage of making it fresh, but it can lead to kind of interesting ending points in certain situations. So in any case, what I've led up to here is a kind of an image of memory as both a reconstructive and a constructive process, and it leads to a couple of rather interesting effects that we can look at. One of these has to do with what is called the deja vu experience, and all of us have had this at various times. It is where you may hear somebody in a given situation, you may see something, but essentially something gets sparked in your memory as a result of initiated in your memory by way of recall, that leads you to convince yourself that I was there, or I remember hearing that, or something like that. In my own instance, it was a visual. The last time that I formally remembered this happening in detail enough that I wrote it down, I had an image when I was driving in Missouri one day. I was on leave at the University of Missouri, and we went out from the city and drove about 50, 60 miles over into the mountainous area toward the east of Missouri. And I was coming over a mountaintop, not a mountaintop, a hill, a significant hill, on a two-lane highway. And as I looked ahead, the highway dropped away down the hill, went across the valley floor, and went across a very obvious cast iron bridge with the over stuff on it across the bridge, and the hill went up the road, up the hill on the other side, and then eventually disappeared. It was maybe 4 or 5 miles away that saw it disappear. And as I came over that hill and hit that scene, I was absolutely convinced that I had been there before. I have seen this previously. And it was, in fact, the classic definition of a deja vu experience. But in fact, I know as well as anybody that I had never been in that particular set of Missouri. My leave experience at the University of Missouri, which was quite neat, was a one-time event. I had never previously been in Missouri other than passing through St. Louis in the airport. And so I know for sure that I was not there, but I experienced it as if I was absolutely there. And the theory is that theoretically what's probably happening is that in terms of the associative basis or model of memory, what's happened is that scene shared enough events with something in my past life that I had in fact experienced that it triggered a false positive reaction. I've been here, when in fact I had not. So the deja vu experience is one that will be explained by these kind of events. And the other one that I do want to spend some time here toward the end of the lecture today has to do with something that all of us have experienced at one time or another, and that is what's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. Okay? It's an experience that has two very predictable features. Number one is partial knowledge. You know that person's name, you know that person's name, and that's the second element. It is partial knowledge. You can't quite recall it, but you're confident that you know it. That is that essentially you're telling yourself, you're saying to yourself, if I spend enough time on this, I will in fact be able to recall it. So the question, of course, is it a failure of memory retrieval, or is it a failure of language production? Which is an interesting kind of problem. I.e., is it a breakdown in memory, or is it a breakdown in the language structure for you and me? It occurs in the typical person roughly once a week. Now, by that, what I mean and what I'm defining is a recall interval, and I should also qualify this, that a tip of the tongue, if we want to define it so that it's happening once a week, is going to have to be defined in terms of an extended but not perpetual period of attempted recall. That is, if we can call it a tip of the tongue, if you can't call the name out that you need when you need it. That happens to me every now in the hallway. You know, I'm walking past somebody, and that's a very delicate social situation for you and I when we pass each other in the hallway, because we're supposed to say, good morning, Peggy, good morning, so-and-so, good morning, name. And I'm lousy at names. I quite easily confess that. But sometimes I know the person, I know the person, and it's a matter of searching through and pulling out the name that I need, and that, in essence, could be considered a tip-of-the-tongue phenomenon. If you've got, 10 seconds before you pass, that could potentially be a tip-of-the-tongue phenomenon, although it's not the one I'm usually talking about here. The usual one I'm talking about here. But it occurs as much as once a week in citizens of the U.S. It's estimated to occur as much as once a week. That's really staggering if you think about it, because you multiply 52 times times the number of citizens in the U.S., and we're up over, what, 300,000 now, 320? That's over 300 billion tip of the tongues annually that are occurring in this country. It is not an infrequent phenomenon that we're dealing with there. I love William James' description of it way back in 1890 in his Principles of Psychology. Talking about what we now call tip of the tongue, he said, "The state of our consciousness. There is a gap therein, but no mere gap. It is a gap that is intensely active, a sort of wraith," which means essentially a ghost or apparition or image. A sort of wraith of the name is in it, beckoning us in a given direction, making us at moments tingle with the sense of our closeness, and then letting us sink back without the longed-for term. If wrong names are proposed to us, this singularly definitive gap acts immediately so as to negate them. They do not fit the mold. And the gap of one word does not feel like the gap of another, all empty of content as both might seem necessarily to be when described as gaps. If you get the time, William James' book is very well written. It's worth going back in the history to read it. Brown and McNeill, the two that are most directly credited with a long-term study of tip of the tongue, and the classic study was done in 1966. It was both good in setting a lot of research precedents. It was also bad in some of the things it ignored and actually suppressed, kept from being written about for an extended period of time. But in essence, we're going to turn to them in just a minute here. They describe tip of the tongue as follows. The signs of it, the tip of the tongue, were unmistakable. He would appear to be in mid-torment, something like the brink of a sneeze, and if he found the word, his relief was considerable. You know what I'm talking about, and there is certainly relief when we're able to sneeze. But the definition I've already put on the screen for you there earlier than I meant to, and that was essentially, it's a strong feeling that a target word, although currently unrecallable, is known and will be recalled. There's considerable optimism associated with it. The classic study was done, as I said, by Brown and McNeill in 1966. They had 56 Harvard undergraduates to whom they read 10 definitions of difficult and uncommon, but not unknown words. That is, they were words which you would understand if you read them. They were clearly in your passive vocabulary in this instance. You were instructed, if you cannot recall it right now, you think you know it, and with some effort you might be able to recall it. That was the instructional set that they were given as they looked at each of the 10 definitions they were asked to write the word for. To give you a sample, see if we can put any of you in a tip-of-the-tongue state, showing favoritisms toward relatives or friends based on that relationship. Does anyone know for sure what I've just defined there? Favoritism toward relatives or friends based on that relationship. Anybody sure they don't know the word? And does anybody think they may know it? Not sure. Well, I've got a unanimous class save one of no votes at all. So I'll go on. In essence, when I do that in introductory where people are still reactive, I can get about, in a class of 400, I can get typically one person with about 2 or 3 definitions, at least one, to be in a true tip-of-the-tongue state. And it's fascinating what you find by way of questions that you can ask them in that situation. In the original study by Brown and McNeill, the undergraduates at Harvard were actually asked to give them a bunch of information without telling them, or without, when they were still not yet able to actually recall the word. So they were asked, for instance, to estimate the number of syllables in the word they had in mind, and then specifically the first letter of their potential answer. So they were asked to guess number of syllables, and they were asked to guess the first letter of the word that they had in mind. They were also asked to suggest or write down any words that sounded like the word that they had in mind. That is, what were their potential candidates, even though they knew they were in fact the wrong answer. Or in other cases they had, and I was not aware of this in the original study, and that is that they had words that meant something like the target. That is, there was a semantic similarity that was involved in that situation. In recalling those words. And what they found in that study was that 244 rated the sound correctly. That is the number of sounds. And I'm going to jump ahead here on the thing, and I don't have the image that I needed, so we're not going to be able to put that on for you. I will reconstruct for you and put on the screen the table that I drew from the the Brown and McNeil study. What I was going to show you is a study that plots number recalled versus actual correct answer. And it turns out the vast majority of the data is right on the diagonal, which means they guessed 2 syllables, and in fact the word they were trying to recall was 2 syllables. The vast majority of numbers are right on in terms of guessing number of syllables. So that's one among many different things that we can actually recall in a tip of the tongue situation. There are all sorts of theoretical explanations about what's going on there, but across a dozen studies covering from 1986 to 1999, all but one, which did not focus on developmental issues, found that younger subjects suffered fewer tip of the tongues than did older subjects. That is, and those were studies that they covered up to people who were aged as much as 80 years of age. 2 different models are suggested to explain what may be involved there. One is what's called a decrement model. That's what's being argued here is that it's the general breakdown in the strength of the interword associations in the network of aging people. Essentially, one would expect an increase in the ability of recall of required words, of the inability to recall as we age, if the associational link is weakening. Interestingly enough, studies that use diaries yield a different conclusion than do lab-based experimental studies, perhaps related to the time pressure in the lab that's not present at the home when you just kind of experience a private tip of the tongue. But in diary-based studies, they reach a different conclusion, probably based on the idea. What I'm saying is that the younger people using the diary technique do have more tip of the tongue phenomena, probably attributable to the greater experience of the older people. They have more knowledge they can look over. And then I'll fill in at the beginning of the next lecture with the incremental model, which is the other explanation theoretically as to why you and I experience tip of the tongue.